The Monday started with the kind of order that fools you into thinking the world runs on rules. 6:30 coffee, 7 o'clock desk, the Hartley Industries acquisition open on my screen for the 20th pass, clauses aligned like soldiers ready for inspection. Outside, Houston's morning moved with the steady confidence of a city that signs its deals in glass towers and seals them over dinners that end past midnight. In a firm like Peterman Legal, reliability was a currency. I had spent 3 years minting it. That was the story I told myself as the email from Jake Peterman arrived at 9:47 a.m. Please come to my office immediately. I saved my work, smoothed my jacket, and stepped into the bright, echoing corridor. Colleagues glanced up and then down again, as if the glass walls were suddenly thicker. 6 weeks into his tenure as executive director, Jake had redecorated the corner office into a parody of achievement. Law books replaced with motivational posters, a pudding green spilling into the place where the partnership's collective memory used to sit. He didn't look up when I knocked. "Sit," he said, gesturing to a chair deliberately lower than his, some consultant's idea of authority. His sneakers were on the mahogany desk his father imported from Italy. "Rachel," he began, phone placed face down as if gravity could sanctify attention. "We need to discuss your future here." "Is there an issue with Hartley?" I asked. "We're 12 million across and clean." "It's not about a specific deal." He steepled his fingers. "It's about cultural fit, synergy, where the firm is going." Yet in 3 years of skipped vacations and nights spent nursing the firm's ancient servers through uploads, reduced to a word that had the texture of a smile but none of its warmth. Cultural fit. I had billed more hours than any non-partner 3 years running. My retention rate sat at 94%. "I'm not following," I said, which was true. I understood the words, but not the logic. "You're competent," he said, and made it sound like a slur. "But we need people who think outside the box. Innovative, disruptive." "Clients do not hire counsel to disrupt statutes," I didn't say. "They hire us to navigate boxes drawn in ink that dries into fines." "What are you saying, Jake?" "Today is your last day." He slid the packet across. NDA, non-compete, 3-month severance for silence. "Security will escort you after you sign. You're firing me the week before Hartley closes. Tori will handle the transition." Tori, the girlfriend hired as a paralegal 4 weeks ago, who still couldn't format a memo and once asked whether "whereas" required a hyphen. Tori, who did not possess a law license. "She can't," I said, and then shut my mouth. It didn't matter. The low chair had done its work. The decision had been made before I walked in. He checked his phone again, bored by the act of rearranging another person's life. 1 hour, he said. "Leave your key card with security. And Rachel, the NDA is non-negotiable." I stood, nodded, and walked the hallway that had once felt like a spine. No one met my eyes. Law firms are efficient at one thing above all: learning where not to look. In my office, a banker's box waited, wide open, like the mouth of a story I didn't want to tell yet. I placed my coffee mug, world's okayest lawyer, on the bottom, then began to inventory what I actually owned. The firm thought I belonged to the letterhead. But I had built systems on my own time, a latticework of contract templates and checklists that shaved hours from diligence and guarded against the kind of errors that grow teeth when left alone. They lived in my personal cloud, not by design so much as neglect. The firm had never asked, never valued, what it couldn't immediately bill. My notes were mine too, ink pressed into paper during 2 a.m. calls when a client's voice betrays exactly how much trouble they're in. Those weren't trade secrets. They were a craftsman's tools, worn to the shape of my hand. Then there were the contacts. Not the public info addresses that trap desperate emails in filters, but the personal numbers saved over years. People who texted pictures of their kids after a deal closed. Who asked for restaurant reservations when in town. Who learned that if you called me at odd hours, the person who picked up knew your business well enough to help right then, not after a memo circulated. In this city, relationships are not a soft metric. They are the only reason the name on the door keeps its syllables. Finally, knowledge. Not the kind stored in document management systems that cough when you ask them to return anything written in the last 10 years, but the kind that lives as patterns in your head. Johnson Tech wants blue ink signatures. Superstition. Never mock it. Meridian's board is in London. Make it morning or lose them. Hartley's vendor agreements hid an arbitration clause I spent months quietly excising. These are not trade secrets. They are the difference between a lawyer who reads and a lawyer who understands. My phone buzzed. Marcus. Heard what happened. Jake says Tori is taking your files. God help us. I didn't respond. The NDA was a boundary I intended to respect, not because I feared litigation, though the Petermans could buy enough of that to darken a sky, but because I traffic in trust. That was always the job. That still was. I opened the Texas rules and reminded myself what non-competes look like in the bright light of a courtroom. They can be real. They can also be theater. Fired without cause, replaced by someone unqualified, the covenant sweeping enough to choke a career. None of that made it ironclad. A good judge sees the space between restraint and retaliation. Still, the rules were the rules. No solicitation, no disclosure, no disparagement. I wrote down what I could do: remain a friend, consult independently, use my own intellectual property, answer if contacted. The distinction mattered. Ethics rarely announce themselves with trumpets. They live in verbs and prepositions. By 4:30, my dining table had become a war room. It wasn't client files. I left those untouched. Those belonged to the firm. It was the architecture I had built around the work. Frameworks that reduced chaos into decision. Scaffolding that turned 3 months of negotiation into a week when it needed to be. I registered a domain, R. Miles Consulting, professional enough to be found, vague enough to be clean. I updated LinkedIn with a single sentence that said everything and nothing. Independent legal consultant. In Houston, you don't need to shout. If you exist, word travels. At 5:43, Patricia Hartley texted, "New lawyer just asked me what force majeure means. Tell me this is a joke." I stared for a beat. I typed, "I'm no longer with Peterman as of today. I hope your deal proceeds smoothly." 2 bubbles appeared, vanished, then, "What? Call me now." I replied that I was bound by agreements and could not discuss specifics. She suggested coffee between friends. As friends always, I wrote, and allowed myself the first real breath since the low chair. Between 8 and midnight, 6 other contacts reached out with variations on, "Please tell me you're still practicing." I answered each with care. A boundary kept is not just legal hygiene, it's the scaffolding of a reputation. Somewhere in a corner office, Jake was likely sending a firm-wide email about fresh perspectives and disruption. He had misdiagnosed the business he inherited. The modern practice is not letterhead, it is 3 a.m. phones and quiet competence. They had the marble lobby and the commissioned portraits. I had everything that could walk out the door. 3 days later, in a conference room at Bailey & Locke that smelled like leather and long memory, Martin studied me over his reading glasses. "I've been wondering when you'd leave that circus," he said. I told him I wasn't looking to violate anything. I was exploring a path that wouldn't require me to end friendships to appease paperwork. He proposed an independent consultant arrangement. No employment, no solicitation, full respect for my constraints, with infrastructure, insurance, and one promise that mattered more than the rest. If Peterman went ugly, I wouldn't face it alone. 40% was steep. Paying for a shield often is. I asked for time. He advised I not take much. In the parking garage, my phone lit again. "Patricia, deal fell through. Missed deadline. Board furious. David Kim had export issues. Sarah Rodriguez had a state notice about data privacy. Marcus. Tori asked if contracts need to be notarized. I'm hiding. And then a number I didn't recognize. Traverse Industries General Counsel. Are you taking new clients? The smart play was to wait out 18 months. The safe play was to disappear and let the firm's choices run their course. But I could see the shape of what was coming. Not just bad service, but harm. A $12 million acquisition hobbled by a missed date is not a teachable moment. It is an avoidable wound. I called Martin back. I accept, I said, with conditions. I won't solicit. I won't share anything that isn't mine. If people come to me, I'll help them. He laughed. I like you already. Start tomorrow? I can start now, I said, and looked at the city lights stacking up against the dusk. Somewhere, in a glass room where the chair was set too low, a son with a famous last name believed he had tightened his grip on the firm. What he had done was let go of the only thing that ever held it together. The first days after a firing carry a strange weight. Time no longer belongs to someone else's calendar, yet it doesn't feel like yours either. My dining table was still covered in notes, my laptop open to cloud folders labeled with acronyms that only I understood. Each page represented hours of precision, the invisible labor behind signatures that made or broke companies. Now they sat like relics of a vanished career. But what Peterman Legal thought they'd erased was only the surface. Below, in the unseen networks of Houston's corporate world, my name still carried weight. By Tuesday, my inbox and phone proved as much. A message from Patricia Hartley lingered on the screen. Rachel, this new lawyer asked me what whereas means. Is this a joke? I typed carefully, never acknowledging the acquisition, only expressing sympathy. Words matter in law, but silence carries its own arguments. Patricia's reply was immediate. Coffee, as friends. I agreed. The distinction mattered. Friends are not clients, and coffee is not solicitation. Word traveled. 6 other clients reached out before the week ended, each one couching their panic in casual tone. Just checking in. Hope you're okay. Where are you these days? I gave the same vague response every time. Independent consulting now. I'm around. Nothing more. It was enough. On Thursday, I sat across from Martin Bailey in a conference room 6 blocks from Peterman Legal. Bailey & Locke LLP had been Houston's second-choice firm for decades. Smaller, leaner, stubbornly resilient. The walls smelled of leather polish and permanence. Martin leaned back, hands folded like he was weighing not a deal, but a gamble. I've been waiting for this, he said, studying me over his glasses. Peterman never deserved you. I'm not looking to poach, I said carefully. I can't. I know. He smiled. But if clients find their way to you, and some already have, you need a home, infrastructure, insurance, a shield. He slid a draft agreement across the table. Independent consultant, not employee. 40% of billings for the firm, litigation coverage included. Steep, but protection has a price. I thought of Jake's smirk, of Patricia's exasperated text, of Marcus hiding from Tori's questions. I'll need to think, I said. Don't think too long, Martin warned. Jake is young, scared, and stupid. That's a dangerous mix. That evening, the messages came faster. Patricia, deal fell through. Missed deadline. Board furious. David Kim from Nexus Industries. Can we talk? Urgent. Sarah Rodriguez. Rachel, please tell me you're still practicing. And one number I didn't recognize. Ms. Miles, I'm General Counsel at Traverse Industries. Patricia suggested I reach out. Are you taking new clients? Traverse Industries, $20 billion in revenue, never a Peterman client. My pulse steadied into something sharper than fear. The smart move was silence, waiting out the 18-month non-compete. But I had watched a $12 million acquisition unravel in 3 days because someone thought law was a matter of vibes. Silence now wasn't safety. It was complicity. I called Martin. "I accept," I said, "with conditions. No solicitation, no stolen files. If they come to me, I'll be ready." He laughed, warm and sure. "I like you already. Monday?" "I can start now," I replied. When I hung up, I sat back in the quiet. Outside, downtown hummed with its nightly rituals, lawyers finishing depositions, executives heading to dinners, clients dialing trusted numbers at inconvenient hours. Peterman Legal still had the name carved into marble, but in a city built on late-night deals and 3 a.m. calls, the marble meant nothing. The only thing that mattered was who answered the phone. And tonight, more and more of them were calling me. The first test came not with a lawsuit, but with a notice. Friday evening, Sarah Rodriguez from Blackstone Holdings called at an hour when most attorneys were already 2 glasses into the weekend. Her voice was tight, threaded with panic. "Rachel, we just got a compliance notice from the state. Something about data privacy violations. Our lawyers say it's boilerplate, but the potential fine is 7 figures. Can you look at it?" Our lawyers still meant Peterman Legal. I hesitated, the NDA flashing in my mind. Then I remembered the line I'd written in my notes. "I can't solicit, but I can respond if contacted." "Send it over," I said. The PDF came through seconds later. One glance told me what their new team had missed. The statute cited was Article 7.3 of the Texas Data Privacy Act, one of the sharpest new teeth regulators had grown in years. Blackstone's retention policies still used language from 2019, obsolete since last summer. Exactly the kind of detail I'd flagged in a memo months ago, the one Jake had probably filed under not urgent. "Sarah," I said gently, "this is not boilerplate. You have 90 days to remediate or you'll face escalating penalties. This is real, serious." "Can you fix it?" she asked. "I can't directly handle it alone, not under my agreements. But Bailey & Locke has a privacy team. I'll coordinate with them. We'll move fast." By Monday, Blackstone had formally retained Bailey & Locke for emergency remediation. The files Peterman sent over as their compliance work were a horror show. Outdated templates, boilerplate lifted from 2015, no evidence of the audit I'd begged them to run last year. We filed Blackstone's remediation plan with 12 hours to spare, sparing them a $2 million penalty. Sarah called me personally. "Rachel, you just saved us more than Peterman billed us in 5 years." That was the first domino. The second tipped almost immediately. David Kim at Nexus Industries discovered an export compliance gap, another regulatory change missed, another fine looming. Patricia Hartley's board whispered about malpractice. Houston is a city of quiet phone calls, and in a matter of days, the word wasn't just that Peterman Legal had stumbled. It was that they'd failed at the basics. Boards fear many things: bad press, activist investors, government probes. But above all, they fear uncertainty. And uncertainty was now the only service Peterman reliably provided. I needed a way to warn without crossing a line. So I built what I called the Regulatory Alert System, short, anonymized bulletins sent to general addresses of Houston corporations citing only public statutes and deadlines. No client names, no proprietary information, just this new regulation took effect. Companies failing to comply face penalties by X date. Nothing more. "You're playing with fire," Martin said when I showed him. "Every regulation I cite is public record," I replied. "If clients realize their current counsel hasn't kept pace, that's their problem, not mine." He studied me for a long moment, then signed off. "Send them." The exodus began quietly. One company requested a second opinion. Another asked for a competitive bid. Then another. In law, words like second opinion and competitive bid are code. They mean our current lawyers have lost our trust. Meanwhile, Marcus kept feeding me dispatches from inside Peterman. Emergency meetings, Jake shouting about loyalty, Tori crying in the bathroom, 3 senior associates resigning in a single day. On Wednesday, the panic crystallized into aggression. A courier delivered a cease and desist order accusing me personally of violating my non-compete and exploiting confidential methodologies. The irony stung. Their methodologies were the same stale templates that had nearly cost Blackstone millions. Janet Walsh, Bailey & Locke's lead litigator, reviewed the letter with a wry smile. "They're bluffing, but bluffers sometimes double down. Be ready." She was right. By the following week, Bradford and Associates, Houston's most notorious scorched earth litigators, entered the field, retained by Peterman. The firm that once defended tobacco companies now aimed its cannons at me. But here's what Jake and his advisors still didn't understand. Lawsuits don't preserve trust. They expose it. And once exposed, the cracks are all anyone sees. The domino line was already toppling. The cease and desist was only the opening shot. Within a week, the storm arrived. 6 lawsuits filed in 3 jurisdictions, each thick with accusations: breach of non-compete, theft of trade secrets, tortious interference. Bradford and Associates had signed their name to every pleading, and that name carried a reputation in Houston's legal circles. They were known not for finesse, but for overwhelming force, a firm that buried opponents under so much paper they suffocated before a judge ever ruled. Bailey & Locke responded with precision. Janet Walsh, our lead litigator, gathered me in a conference room that smelled faintly of toner and war. "They'll throw every claim at you, Rachel. They don't need to win. They just need to make you bleed fees until you fold. But here's the truth. If your documentation is clean, we can turn their storm into their downfall." So I opened my files. Every text, every email, every note since the day I walked out of Peterman's marble lobby. Patricia's invitation to coffee, Sarah's panicked midnight call, David Kim's urgent questions, all unsolicited, all preserved. Janet reviewed them with the eye of a surgeon, nodding slowly. "This is good. Very good. If they push this to discovery, they'll regret it." The case moved fast. A federal injunction hearing was scheduled before Judge Chen, a jurist known for her sharp memory and sharper disdain for corporate melodrama. On the morning of the hearing, the courtroom felt less like a place of law and more like an amphitheater. Bradford's team filled one side, 6 partners, and a phalanx of associates armed with binders thick as dictionaries. On our side, Martin, Janet, 2 junior attorneys, and me. David versus Goliath, but David had the documents. Judge Chen entered, her gaze sweeping the room like a searchlight. "Peterman Legal alleges a coordinated conspiracy to destroy their business," she began. "Ms. Walsh, your response?" Janet stood, calm as if she'd been rehearsing this her whole career. "Your Honor, no conspiracy exists. Clients are sophisticated actors making independent decisions. They left Peterman not because of Rachel Miles, but because of Peterman Legal's own failures." Bradford rose, booming with righteous indignation. "The timeline speaks for itself. Ms. Miles was terminated on Monday. By Friday, Peterman lost 12 clients. By the end of 2 weeks, 26. Coincidence does not explain this. Orchestration does." Judge Chen tilted her head. "Do you have evidence of solicitation?" "The pattern is evidence," Bradford insisted. Then she turned to me. "Ms. Miles, please stand." I rose, my palms damp against the wood of the table. "You worked at Peterman for 3 years?" "Yes, Your Honor." "And you were terminated without cause?" "Yes, Your Honor. The reason given was cultural fit. I was replaced by someone without a law license." A ripple of whispers cut across the gallery. Even William Peterman, seated stiffly in the front row, shifted uncomfortably. "Did you solicit any Peterman clients after your termination?" "No, Your Honor. Every communication I received was initiated by them. I have documentation of each." And what of Thorne Industries? Peterman alleges you received confidential information about their contracts. The courtroom held its breath. I swallowed once. I received an unsolicited email from a Peterman attorney. I did not request it, nor act on it directly. I forwarded it to a colleague. That is the extent of my involvement. Bradford leapt up. Semantics, Your Honor. Sit down, Mr. Bradford. Judge Chen's voice cut like a blade. I've been a prosecutor and a judge for nearly 2 decades. I know the difference between semantics and fact. Unless you can prove Ms. Miles solicited information or acted on it directly, you have no case. Bradford faltered, then tried again. But the pattern, she interrupted, shows a firm hemorrhaging clients after firing the person who held their trust. That is not conspiracy. That is capitalism. The gavel fell. Case dismissed with prejudice. Peterman Legal will pay defendants' fees. And Mr. Bradford, file another case this flimsy in my courtroom, and I will consider sanctions. The echo of her gavel still hung in the air as we filed out. Bradford's army looked stunned, their binders suddenly weightless. Across the aisle, William Peterman's face was stone, his legacy unraveling in real time. Jake, notably, was absent. By afternoon, the courtroom battle had become headlines. Houston Business Daily ran, Peterman Legal crushed in court as clients flee. On local cable news, the footage was harsher still. Reporters ambushed William outside the courthouse. His shoulders sagged, his voice reduced to a tired, no comment. Cameras later caught Jake trying to sneak out a back entrance, cornered by microphones. Mr. Peterman, did you fire Rachel Miles to hire your girlfriend? He tried to deny it, but the questions came faster than his denials. Does your girlfriend have a law license? Silence. Did she miss the Hartley deadline? His face turned crimson. Finally, in a fatal misstep, he blurted, This is a witch hunt orchestrated by Rachel Miles. So you confirm she was instrumental to your firm's success? A reporter shot back. His mouth opened, but no words came. The footage replayed on every network, a public autopsy of competence. Inside Bailey and Locke, the phones lit up. Blackstone filed malpractice claims. Other companies prepared termination letters. Peterman's collapse wasn't just legal now, it was reputational, and reputations in Houston crumble faster than buildings in controlled demolition. From my office window, I could see Peterman's tower 6 blocks away, once a monument to generational prestige. Now, lit from within by panic, it looked less like a fortress and more like a sinking ship, and the city had just watched the water pour in, live on television. The collapse of Peterman Legal had become more than gossip. It was now a matter of survival for dozens of corporations. What began as whispered frustration in boardrooms hardened into a coordinated response. The epicenter of that response was Traverse Industries. Their general counsel, Joyce Brennan, had the reputation of a woman who'd seen every trick in the book and had rewritten half of them herself. When she strode into Bailey and Locke's offices, she carried both news and a proposition. Peterman called our CEO yesterday, she said, her voice even but sharp as glass. Threatened litigation against any company that hires Rachel Miles, claimed she stole trade secrets. Our CEO's response was simple. Traverse doesn't negotiate with terrorists. We're moving our representation to Bailey and Locke. Her words lit the room with something more powerful than optimism. Inevitability. Traverse was not just another client. They were a signal to the entire Houston corporate ecosystem. And Joyce wasn't finished. I've also spoken to my peers, she continued. Hartley, Nexus, Blackstone. We're forming what we're calling a legal defense consortium. Any company targeted by Peterman for switching firms will have its defense funded by the group. You attack one of us, you fight all of us. The strategy was brutal in its elegance. Instead of scattering in fear of Peterman's lawsuits, the corporations were binding themselves together, turning defense into offense. Within 24 hours, 17 companies had joined. By week's end, 23. The exodus was no longer piecemeal. It was collective. For the first time, Bailey & Locke's modest conference room felt like the command center of a campaign. CEOs, general counsels, and board members crowded the long table. The agenda was simple: decide the fate of Peterman Legal. Joyce called the vote. Do we buy them out or let them burn? The argument split the room. Half wanted a clean surgical dissolution, purchase Peterman's assets, redistribute their client files, and transition staff. The other half wanted blood, to let the firm collapse as a warning to every board that might consider nepotism over competence. I sat quietly watching. These were my former clients, people who had trusted me at 3 a.m. when contracts threatened to collapse. Now they were deciding whether to execute a century-old firm. Their eyes turned to me. The irony was not lost. Rachel Miles, fired for lacking cultural fit, would cast the deciding vote. Buyout, I said at last, but I set conditions. No rewards for those who enabled Jake. Senior partners who stood by get nothing. Staff who had no say get severance or offers at new firms. And Jake himself, he signs a public statement admitting his role in the collapse. No statement, no deal. The room buzzed with murmurs. Martin Bailey frowned. He'll never sign. Then, Joyce said coldly, we let them burn. 2 days later, negotiations convened at Baker Botts, a neutral ground, as if neutrality still existed. William Peterman came himself, looking older, the lines on his face drawn deep by the weight of legacy lost. He listened in silence as Joyce outlined the terms. Asset transfer, employment offers to staff, retirement funds intact for him, nothing for Jake. And the statement, Joyce concluded, sliding a single page across the table. An admission of failure, signed by Jake. William's hands shook as he read. This will destroy him. No firm will ever take him on. Joyce's tone was merciless. He destroyed himself. This only makes it official. Silence stretched across the room. At last, William signed. Jake won't agree, he muttered. Then bankruptcy it is, Janet replied, and discovery will show exactly who he handed client files to. The next morning, headlines carried Jake's statement. Carefully worded, legalistic, but unmistakable. His mismanagement had led to a loss of client trust. By noon, Peterman Legal no longer existed. Its name was retired, its building leased to rivals, its staff absorbed into firms that valued competence over pedigree. That afternoon, Marcus texted me. Got an offer at Morrison Klein, senior associate. Thank you. I typed back, I didn't do anything. His reply came fast. You did everything. Peterman Legal had been a skyscraper built on marble, glass, and name. But skyscrapers don't fall because of a single blow. They fall when their foundation rots. All I had done was refuse to be buried in the rubble. And as the dust settled, I realized the city wasn't just watching the death of a firm. It was watching the rebirth of a reputation. The day after Peterman's obituary ran in the Houston Chronicle, I sat in my new office at Bailey & Locke. A corner suite, sunlight spilling over the skyline, the tower that once bore the Peterman name still visible but now dark, its lobby banner replaced by a realtor's for lease. I didn't need to look at it often. The building itself had become a cautionary tale etched into Houston's collective memory. Martin entered without knocking, a sheet of paper in his hand. Partnership vote was unanimous. Welcome aboard, Rachel. Full equity. Southeast corner. I let the words settle. 3 weeks earlier, I had walked out of Peterman with a banker's box and a severance clause. Now I was partner at a firm that had built its survival on merit, not lineage. The irony wasn't lost on either of us. That afternoon, my assistant knocked. Ms. Miles, your 5 o'clock is here. I turned from the window expecting another client. Instead, it was William Peterman. He looked healthier than he had in court, retirement already smoothing the edges of defeat. "May I sit?" he asked. Of course. He lowered himself into the chair across from me, the one set deliberately equal in height to mine. No power plays here. "I owe you an apology," he began. "You don't owe me anything," I said. "I do. I built that firm on one principle: take care of your people, and they'll take care of your clients. Somewhere along the way, I forgot that. I let my son forget it. The day before he fired you, I called him from Italy and told him to make you partner. He said you were too rigid, too focused on details." He gave a bitter laugh. "Fresh perspectives," he called it. Turns out his girlfriend couldn't even spell, whereas. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence carried 40 years of legacy lost to 6 months of arrogance. At last, William stood. "I didn't come here to beg for anything, just to say thank you for ending it cleanly. A quick death is a mercy, even if it doesn't feel like one." After he left, I found myself thinking less about his son's failure and more about his father's forgotten wisdom. That law is not about disruption or marble lobbies. It's about trust. Break that, and you are no longer a lawyer. You're just a merchant in paper. A week later, my phone buzzed with an unexpected message from Tori. "Ms. Miles, I know I have no right to ask, but I'm applying to law school. Would you consider writing me a recommendation?" My first instinct was to delete it. The woman had sat in my chair and watched million-dollar deals collapse because she didn't know the basics. But then I remembered William's words, and something inside me shifted. People fail. People also change. "Send me your application materials," I typed back. "We'll discuss it over coffee." Because that was the work, wasn't it? Not revenge. Not even redemption. It was building something worth protecting, and then protecting it with everything you had. 6 months later, I stood before 20 fresh associates at Bailey & Locke, delivering the keynote for their orientation. "Good afternoon," I began. "The most important thing you'll ever learn in this profession isn't case law. Any decent AI can do that now. It isn't billing hours either. What matters is trust. Lose it, and you lose everything. Keep it, and you build something that lasts." I looked at their eager faces and saw versions of myself 3 years earlier, ambitious, naive, unaware how quickly power could turn. Behind me on the wall hung a framed clipping. Bailey & Locke emerges as Houston's fastest-growing firm. Below it, in smaller print, success attributed to innovative compliance practice and exceptional client retention. No mention of Peterman. No mention of Jake. History, I had learned, is written by those who survive, and we hadn't just survived. We had thrived. "Now, sir," I told the room, "let's talk about what trust really means." The city outside glowed in the late light, the Peterman Tower dim and vacant. The lesson of its fall wasn't marble deep. It was carved into every contract, every handshake, every phone call answered at 3 a.m. And it would be the lesson I carried, the one I would teach, long after the name Peterman was just a story whispered at conferences about how not to run a firm. Because the best revenge, I had learned, was not destruction. It was building something better in the ashes.